Under a sky of lights and roaring cheers, at the height of his glory, Freddie Mercury stood on stage, radiant, commanding, larger than life. The sound of 70,000 voices merged into one, echoing "Love of my life." But amidst that ocean of faces, something small, almost invisible, caught his eye. Just beyond the barrier stood a little girl with Down syndrome, holding a handmade sign that said in shaky letters, "I love you, Freddie." The crowd around her didn't notice, but Freddie did. The moment he saw her, the music in his mind stopped. The rhythm, the lights, the noise. Everything faded into stillness. The guards hesitated, unsure of what to do, but Freddie smiled gently and lowered his microphone. That smile, that single quiet gesture, would become one of the most unforgettable moments in music history. It was the night when a man worshipped by millions knelt before innocence, and in that act reminded the world that the purest kind of love needs no spotlight. The roar of Wembley that night was like thunder rolling across the earth. More than 70,000 souls sang "Love of My Life" in perfect harmony, their voices trembling with devotion. Lights from the stage painted the crowd in gold, and every beat of the drums made the ground tremble. Freddie, in his iconic yellow jacket, moved with the energy of a storm, commanding every inch of the stage, every heartbeat in the arena. No one could have guessed that in the middle of that spectacle, one small figure was about to change everything. Near the front barrier stood a little girl, about 8 years old, her eyes wide with wonder and joy. In her tiny hands, she held a piece of cardboard decorated with crayons and stickers. It read, "Freddie, my heart sings with you." The girl, who had Down syndrome, waved and jumped as high as she could, hoping her hero would notice. Her mother stood behind her, tears in her eyes, not from sadness, but from the simple miracle of seeing her daughter so alive, so happy. Then, in the middle of a song, Freddie saw her. His steps slowed, his eyes locked on the child as if time itself had stopped. "What's going on?" Brian May whispered, still playing his guitar. But Freddie raised his hand, a silent command for everything to stop. The lights dimmed slightly, and a wave of confusion rippled through the crowd. Suddenly, a hush fell over the stadium. 70,000 people held their breath. Freddie walked slowly to the edge of the stage. He smiled softly, then nodded to security. The guards hesitated, then opened the barrier. A collective murmur rose from the audience as the little girl was gently lifted and guided toward the stage. Her hands were shaking. Her eyes shone like stars. When she finally stood before him, Freddie knelt down. His voice, usually powerful enough to shake walls, was now tender and fragile. "Hello, darling," he said, touching her cheek gently. In that instant, the legend became a man, and the stage became a temple of pure love. For a few seconds, the entire stadium stood still, holding its breath. Freddie gazed at the little girl as if he were seeing something sacred, a reflection of innocence in a world too noisy for purity. The girl trembled slightly, her small hands clutching the edge of his jacket. Freddie smiled, knelt again, and opened his arms. She ran into them without hesitation, and he lifted her up, turning toward the sea of lights that shimmered like stars before them. "They're all here for you too," he whispered. The crowd erupted in applause, not because of a song, but because of a feeling that no melody could capture. When the cheers softened, Freddie crouched beside her. "What's your favorite song, darling?" he asked softly. The girl didn't answer with words. Instead, she pressed a hand to her heart and whispered, "Love of my life." Freddie's lips curved into a tender smile. That song, his most vulnerable, had found its truest listener. He stood, lifted his microphone again, and looked over at Brian May. A single nod was all it took. The gentle chords of "Love of My Life" began to flow through the night air. Freddie didn't start singing right away. He waited. He looked at the girl again, her eyes wide, glowing with wonder, and took a deep breath. Then, in a voice stripped of all performance and bravado, he began, "Love of my life, you've hurt me." The words floated softly, carried not by fame or technique, but by affection. The little girl swayed beside him, trying to mimic the rhythm. Freddie guided her closer to the microphone, and together they shared a verse. Her voice was unsteady, childlike, imperfect, and utterly beautiful. The audience broke into tears. Thousands of people watched, knowing they were witnessing something that would never happen again. When the final chord echoed across the stadium, Freddie lifted the girl's hand high above her head, as if crowning her queen of the night. The ovation was thunderous, but Freddie didn't bow. He only smiled at her, leaned close, and whispered something only she could hear. "Never forget this, my love. Tonight, you taught me what music really is." As the crowd chanted his name, he gently walked her to the edge of the stage and watched her return to her mother's arms. The lights blazed once more, but Freddie's heart was somewhere else, with a child who had reminded him that greatness meant nothing without love. The concert roared on, but Freddie's soul was still standing at the edge of that stage. Even as he sang, "We are the champions," and the crowd screamed his name, something deep inside him had shifted. He finished the show in triumph, bowing beneath a storm of cheers. Yet behind the glitter and sweat, there was a silence no one else could hear. When the last note faded and the lights went down, he left the stage quietly. No grand exit, no theatrics. Just a man holding a small white handkerchief that smelled faintly of perfume and innocence. Back in his dressing room, the noise of celebration echoed faintly through the concrete walls. Technicians shouted, managers argued, roadies laughed. But Freddie sat alone, motionless, staring at the cloth in his hands. A small red heart was embroidered in one corner, clumsy stitches made with love. "She gave me this," he murmured almost to himself. Peter Freestone, his loyal assistant, entered and froze at the sight of him. Freddie's stage makeup still glimmered under the dressing room light, but his eyes were wet. Peter had seen him in every mood, fierce, furious, flamboyant, but never like this. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then Freddie finally whispered, "When she looked at me." She didn't see Freddie Mercury, the star. She just saw a man singing. His voice cracked on the last word. "Do you know how rare that is, Peter? To be seen, not as a god, not as a ghost, but as a person?" Peter nodded quietly, unsure what to say. Freddie leaned back, exhaling deeply, his reflection staring back at him through the mirror. The painted eyes of the performer seemed to belong to someone else. "All these years," he continued softly, "I thought applause was what I needed. But tonight a little girl reminded me it's love that fills the silence." A single tear rolled down his cheek. He wiped it quickly and gave a half-smile, as if ashamed of his own emotion. "God, I'm turning into a sentimental old fool," he muttered, forcing a laugh. But Peter saw through it. Freddie wasn't being dramatic, he was transformed. That night, while the city outside still echoed with the afterglow of his performance, Freddie placed the handkerchief on his dressing table beside a single white rose. "Keep this safe," he said softly. "It's worth more than all the gold records on that wall." And with that, he turned off the lights. For the first time in years, the great Freddie Mercury went to sleep in silence, not lonely, but human. Morning came quietly over London, grey and heavy with drizzle. Freddie sat by the window of his hotel suite, holding a cup of tea gone cold, staring out at the fog that blanketed the city. He hadn't slept much. The image of the little girl's smile replayed in his mind like a melody that refused to fade. "I need to know her name," he finally said aloud, breaking the silence. Peter Freestone, who was sorting through fan letters on the table, looked up in surprise. "Whose name?" Freddie turned from the window, his voice soft but steady. "The girl from last night. The one with the sign. Find her, Peter." Peter hesitated. "Freddie, there were 70,000 people there." "It'll be impossible." Freddie's eyes sharpened with that familiar glint, the look that used to make record executives nervous. "Nothing's impossible when it matters," he said. He stood, running a hand through his hair, restless, driven by something he couldn't quite explain. "She reminded me why I started singing in the first place. I owe her more than just a song." There was no drama in his tone, no stage flourish. It was the voice of a man chasing a truth he didn't want to lose. Later that day, the Queen production team gathered in a backstage office. The crew, still buzzing from the success of the concert, went silent as Freddie entered. "I need a favor," he said simply. "There was a little girl in the front row last night. She had a sign. She came on stage. Find her, please." The room exchanged glances, uncertain, but no one dared refuse him. A few began calling venue staff. Others checked security footage and press photos. Freddie paced the room quietly, humming to himself, clutching the handkerchief like a talisman. Hours passed, and with each tick of the clock he grew more anxious, not out of obsession, but out of longing. Finally, as evening fell, Peter returned, holding a small piece of paper. "We found her," he said softly. Freddie froze. "Her name is Clara. She lives just outside London with her mother. She's still talking about you." Freddie took the note slowly, as if it were made of glass. "Clara," he repeated under his breath, tasting the name like a lyric. Then he looked up, eyes gleaming with quiet urgency. "Get the car ready," he said. "I'm not leaving this city until I see her again." For once, it wasn't the legend speaking, it was the man behind the voice, answering a call only the heart could hear. The sky was pale and heavy with drizzle as Freddie's car wound through the narrow streets outside London. He sat in the back seat, wrapped in a long, dark coat, his usual flamboyance replaced by quiet anticipation. "No press, no cameras," he had told Peter before they left. "Some things don't belong on a stage." The city noise faded behind them, replaced by the soft hum of tires on wet pavement. Freddie stared out the window, watching raindrops chase each other down the glass. For once, he wasn't thinking about the next performance or the next song, only about the little girl who had looked at him as if he were something good. They arrived at a small brick house on a modest street. Peter knocked, and a woman opened the door. The moment she saw who was standing there, she froze, her hand flying to her mouth. "Mr. Mercury," she whispered, her voice trembling. Freddie smiled gently and removed his sunglasses. "Please call me Freddie. I came to thank you for letting your daughter climb on that stage last night." Tears welled in the woman's eyes as she stepped aside to let him in. Inside, the house was filled with warmth, drawings pinned to the wall, the scent of tea, a few toys scattered across the floor. In the middle of the room sat Clara, playing with a doll, humming softly to herself. When she looked up and saw him, her face lit up like the sun breaking through clouds. "Freddie!" she cried, running to him. Freddie knelt down just in time to catch her in his arms. The hug was small, clumsy, and perfect. "I brought you something," he said, pulling from his pocket a tiny silver pendant shaped like a star. "Because that's what you are." He placed it gently around her neck. Clara giggled and touched his face. "Mummy says you sing so people don't feel sad," she said matter-of-factly. Freddie's eyes glistened. "Then your mummy's right," he whispered, his voice trembling. They spent nearly an hour together, sitting on the floor as Clara showed him her drawings. One was of the concert, the two of them standing on the stage surrounded by hearts. "Can I keep this?" he asked. She nodded proudly. Before leaving, he hugged her once more. "Keep singing, little one," he said softly. "The world needs hearts like yours." At the door, her mother thanked him through quiet tears. Freddie smiled faintly. "Don't thank me," he replied. "Your daughter reminded me what love looks like." As he stepped out into the drizzle, he turned back for one last look. Clara was waving from the window, the tiny silver star glittering at her neck, a light that would stay with him forever. That night, Freddie was back on stage. A different city, a different crowd, yet something in him had changed forever. The swagger was still there, the power, the brilliance. But behind it all was a new stillness, a quiet kind of joy that the audience could somehow feel. When the lights dimmed and the first wave of cheers thundered through the arena, Freddie raised the microphone. But instead of beginning with his usual explosive energy, he stood in silence. The crowd grew hushed, sensing something unusual. Then in a calm, steady voice he said, "Last night I met someone who reminded me why I do this. Why any of this matters. This song is for her, and for every pure heart that gives life to music." Brian May looked over, already knowing what was coming. Roger Taylor slowed the rhythm, letting the air thicken with emotion. Freddie took a deep breath, and the first gentle chords of Love of My Life floated out once again. But this time, it wasn't the polished performance of a superstar. It was a confession, tender, intimate, raw. The audience swayed, drawn into the softness of his voice. Every syllable carried gratitude, every pause felt like a heartbeat. No one in the crowd knew about Clara, but everyone felt her presence in the way Freddie sang, as if he were holding someone invisible in his arms. Halfway through the song, Freddie pulled a white handkerchief from his pocket, Clara's, and held it up. A single spotlight caught it, making the little red heart shimmer in the air. The audience erupted, clapping and crying without knowing why. Freddie smiled through the tears that had begun to gather in his eyes. He didn't hide them this time. He let them fall as he sang, his voice trembling on the words, "Hurry back! Hurry back!" It was no longer just a love song. It was a prayer, a thank you, and a promise. When the final chord faded, there was no instant applause, just silence, the kind that feels like reverence. Then the crowd rose, applauding until the sound became a wave of pure emotion. Freddie wiped his face, laughed softly, and said into the microphone, "Sometimes a song doesn't change the world, but it can change a heart, and that's enough." That night, newspapers called it Freddie's most emotional performance ever, but no one really knew what they had witnessed. That behind the lights and fame, a man had rediscovered his own humanity through the love of a little girl. The next morning, the headlines across the United Kingdom didn't talk about Freddie's voice or Queen's electric energy. They spoke of something else entirely. Freddie Mercury's unexpected gesture moves thousands. Photographs of him on stage holding the small white handkerchief flooded the papers. No one knew the full story, but everyone felt the weight of that moment. There was something different in his eyes, one journalist wrote. For a few minutes, the man who was larger than life seemed to belong to all of us. Within days, fan mail began to arrive. Not the usual letters of admiration or requests for autographs, but heartfelt notes from parents of children with disabilities. They wrote things like, "Thank you, Freddie, for seeing them as we do, as beautiful." Peter Freestone remembered how quiet Freddie became while reading those letters. He didn't make jokes or deflect with his usual wit. He simply sat in silence, eyes moving slowly across each page. One afternoon he called Peter over, holding a child's drawing in his hands. "Look at this," he said. It showed a stick-figure Freddie with a child beside him, both surrounded by hearts. "A boy wrote that he wants to be a singer, because if I could hug a girl like him on stage, maybe the world isn't so cruel after all." Freddie looked down at the drawing for a long time. "People think concerts are about power and noise," he murmured. "But it's moments like that, when someone feels seen, that truly matter." From then on, Freddie wore Clara's handkerchief tied around his wrist at every show. He never explained it publicly, but fans noticed. Soon, audiences began arriving with white handkerchiefs embroidered with red hearts, waving them during Love of My Life. What started as a single gesture became a quiet movement of kindness, a symbol of empathy born from a child's smile. It spread from city to city, from concert to concert, unspoken but powerful. Freddie never asked for it. He simply accepted it with a soft smile, his eyes glimmering with gratitude. In interviews that followed, reporters asked him what fame meant to him. Usually he would answer with sarcasm or a laugh. But one day he paused and said simply, "Fame isn't about having millions listen to you. It's about touching one's soul and being remembered with love." That quote appeared in newspapers around the world, and fans began bringing banners that read, "One heart is enough." As the years went by, Freddie continued to carry Clara's handkerchief on stage. And though few knew the true story behind it, those who watched him perform could sense it, that somewhere in his heart, the laughter of a little girl still echoed with every note. Months passed, but the memory of that night never left Freddie. No matter how many shows he performed, no matter how loud the applause, a part of him always drifted back to that small, quiet moment when the world had stopped and innocence had looked him straight in the eyes. Sometimes before walking on stage, he would pause backstage, his fingers brushing against the white handkerchief tied around his wrist. "She gave this to me without knowing what it meant," he once said to Peter, "but it's worth more than all the diamonds in this industry." One afternoon, while recording in the studio, a small package arrived. It had no return address, only a note that read, "For Freddie, from your little friend." Inside was a folded piece of paper and a handmade bracelet, red thread with a tiny silver star charm. The letter was written in large, uneven letters, colorful and filled with heart stickers. "Thank you for singing with me. You made me brave. I love you, Freddie." There was a drawing too, Freddie on stage with wings, surrounded by hearts and smiling faces. He stared at it for a long time, the corners of his eyes glistening. "She sent me my own light back," he whispered. From that day on, Freddie began wearing the bracelet beside the handkerchief. It wasn't for show, and no one was allowed to touch it. "This isn't part of the costume," he told the wardrobe crew. "It's part of me." Even as the tours continued and the weight of fame grew heavier, that small bracelet reminded him of something pure, something untouched by the chaos of the world he lived in. As the first signs of illness began to show, the fatigue, the days that felt longer, Freddie often looked down at his wrist for strength. "That little girl," he once said softly, "she taught me that beauty isn't about perfection. It's about truth." One evening after rehearsal, Brian May noticed him staring off quietly. "Thinking about her again?" he asked. Freddie smiled faintly. "Yes, I wonder if she knows how much she changed me." He looked down at his wrist, twisting the red thread between his fingers. "She didn't want anything from me. She didn't care about fame or money. She just loved." Brian nodded, too moved to speak. Freddie turned back toward the piano and said something that stayed with Brian for years. "The purest kind of love doesn't shout, darling. It just touches you and never leaves." And with that he began to play softly, his voice carrying the tenderness of a man who had finally learned to sing, not from ambition, but from his heart. Years passed, and the light that once burned so fiercely inside Freddie began to flicker. The illness had stolen his strength, but not his spirit. He refused to stop singing. Music was still his language, his lifeline, the one place where pain couldn't reach him. When the night of one of his final concerts arrived, the air in the stadium felt charged, not with excitement, but with reverence. The crowd didn't know it, but they were about to witness something sacred. Freddie stepped onto the stage, dressed entirely in white, a vision of grace and fragility. He wasn't the explosive showman that evening. He was something quieter, a man saying goodbye in the only way he knew how. The applause faded into silence as Freddie approached the microphone. His voice, though softer than before, carried a weight that silenced thousands. "This song," he said, pausing for breath, "is for someone who taught me how to sing with my heart, even when the body can't." The band began to play "Love of My Life." The familiar melody floated through the air, but this time it wasn't about lost love or fame. It was about gratitude, memory and connection. Freddie sang not to the crowd, but to someone unseen. Behind him, the giant screen projected images from his life, the crowds, the stages, the glory. But at the very end, one photo appeared that no one expected. A moment captured years before, Freddie kneeling to embrace a little girl in a blue dress. The audience fell into complete silence. His voice trembled as he sang the final verse, and when he reached the words, "Bring it back, bring it back," his eyes lifted toward the heavens. He raised his wrist, showing the white handkerchief and the red bracelet still tied together, and whispered into the mic, "For you, my darling Clara." As the last note faded, Freddie didn't bow. He simply stood there, smiling faintly through tears. The crowd rose to its feet, clapping and crying, unsure what they had just experienced, but knowing it was something eternal. Freddie pressed his hand to his heart and said quietly, "Promise kept, my love." Those were his final words on stage that night. When the lights dimmed and he disappeared into the shadows of the wings, a strange peace settled over the arena, as if the music itself had stopped to say thank you. When Freddie Mercury left the world, the silence he left behind was louder than any applause he had ever received. Fans flooded the streets with candles, flowers, and messages of love. Around the world, people sang "Love of My Life" as tears fell from their eyes, not just for the artist, but for the man whose heart had touched millions. But among all the stories about his genius, his fame, and his wildness, one small story began to resurface, whispered first among fans, then passed along like a secret prayer. The night Freddie stopped the show for a little girl with Down syndrome. At first, it was only a rumor, a photograph here, a brief mention there. Then, a grainy home video surfaced, Freddie kneeling on stage, smiling at a child in a blue dress. No one knew her name, but everyone knew what they were seeing, the purest form of love ever shown in front of an audience. Soon, the image spread everywhere. Fans began to bring white handkerchiefs with red hearts to Queen tribute concerts, waving them during Love of My Life. The gesture became a symbol of kindness, of inclusion, of the belief that even in the loudest moments, tenderness can still be heard. Years later, Peter Freestone confirmed the story. In an interview, he said softly, "Yes, she was real. Her name was Clara. Freddie visited her, and he kept the little handkerchief she gave him until the very end." The world listened in awe. People wrote letters to Queen's fan club, sharing how that story had changed them. Parents of children with disabilities said they finally felt seen. One newspaper called it, "The night rock and love became the same thing." And somewhere in a quiet corner of London, Clara's mother wrote a letter that would move the world. "My daughter didn't know who Freddie Mercury was. She just knew he made her feel loved." And from that day on, she never stopped singing. Today, decades later, when Love of My Life echoes in a concert hall or through a radio speaker, you can sometimes see fans raising white cloths with red hearts, their silent tribute to a bond that transcended fame, music, and time. Freddie once wrote on a scrap of paper found after his death, "Love doesn't need applause. It only needs a heart to listen." And so, every time someone sings his words, every time a child smiles in innocence, every time compassion triumphs over noise, Freddie and Clara live again. Their song never ended. It simply became eternal.